I was 21 years old the night I married Amos Stoltzfus, and I stood in the bedroom that was now ours in a dress the color of a deep evening sky, waiting on a voice I had never once heard say my name. A tin wash basin sat full and untouched on the washstand. A kerosene lamp burned low and steady on the sill, throwing a small circle of yellow light across the floorboards. His work boots had stopped just inside the closed door and stayed there, and he had not yet said one word. I knew the sound of his buggy wheels on the gravel of our lane before I ever knew his face well. I knew his handwriting from a feed order he had once left at my father's barn, the letters careful and upright. But I had never heard him speak a sentence meant only for me, not once, not before that night, and I did not know, standing in that dress in that lamplight, what his voice would sound like when it finally came, or what it would ask of me first. The evening milking was finished, the cans standing cooled and covered in the spring house, when my dade sat me down on the bench by the stove and told me, in the plain and settled voice he used for weather and for scripture both, that I would marry Amos Stoltzfus of the Far District, that the match was gut, that our Ordnung required nothing more of me than to be willing. My mam stood behind him with a cloth still in her hands from the supper dishes. I asked, before either of them could rise from the subject, if I might speak to Amos once, only once, before I gave my answer. I did not ask to refuse him. I only wanted to hear for myself what kind of man he was when he opened his mouth. My father looked to my mother instead of answering me himself. She came and stood behind my chair and began to smooth the strings of my cap, the way she had done since I was small, and told me, slipping briefly into the Dutch the way she did whenever she wanted a matter to feel settled for good, that the fathers had already spoken, that this was how it was done and had always been done in our district, that a girl did not need a private conversation to know a man was suitable, only her parents' judgment and the deacon's blessing and her own willing heart. I sat very still under her hands. Around us the kitchen held its ordinary evening sounds, the clock, the stove settling, my younger sister shelling peas at the far end of the table, and I understood, without anyone saying it plainly, that the matter was finished before I had opened my mouth to begin it. I said, "Gut, then," because that was the word permitted to me, and my mother's hands paused only a moment on my cap strings before she went on smoothing them, satisfied, and my father returned to his coffee as though the whole matter had been no larger than deciding which field to plant in oats. The Ordnung of our district did not forbid a bride from asking questions exactly, but it left no accepted place for the asking, and no one in that kitchen seemed to feel the lack of one. The kitchen smelled of the ham my mother had left simmering for the next day's dinner, and outside the window the barn cats moved along the fence in the last gray light, going about the ordinary business of the evening as though nothing in our house had shifted at all. I went to bed that night turning the name Amos over in my mind, a name I had heard many times at Gmae and never once attached to a voice, and I told myself a willing heart was a fine thing to carry into a marriage, even if I could not yet say what I was being asked to be willing about. Church came to a neighbor's home 3 weeks before the wedding, the benches set up in the front room and the kitchen opened through to the sitting room the way it always was for Gmae, and Amos sat across that room among the men, close enough that I could see the part in his hair and the plainness of his good coat, and far enough that not one word passed directly between us the whole afternoon. When there was a question to be asked, an aunt or an uncle carried it across the room and back again. Small, ordinary things, whether he preferred his eggs from our hens or his own family's, whether he would want the wedding table set with the blue dishes or the white ones. I sat with a scrap of paper folded small in my sewing basket, the back of a canning label torn from a jar of peaches, and on it I had written one plain question, nothing bold, only something I wanted to know about how he meant to run a household, and I meant to find some safe moment to have it carried to him the way the others had been carried. My mother found it that same evening while looking for her needle case, unfolded it before I could stop her, and without any anger in her voice, only a kind of tired patience, folded it again and set it back exactly where it had been, and told me it was not the place of a bride to be sending notes across a Gmail like a schoolgirl. I did not argue with her. There was no accepted argument to make. I only sat afterward turning the folded paper over once in my hand before I put it back exactly as she had left it, the ink of my one question pressed thin against the crease, and thought of how strange it was that a girl could be trusted to put up jar after jar of tomatoes alone, but not trusted to carry one honest question across a room. Meanwhile, the women around me spent that whole visiting hour discussing my new cap, the width of the pleats and the set of the strings, the fabric of my wedding dress, and the exact fall of the hem, the particular shade of blue my mother had chosen, all of it decided over my head and in my hearing, as though I were a piece of the furniture being admired rather than the one who would wear it. I did not have a word for it yet. I only knew that I could sit inside a room full of my own wedding plans and feel, the entire time, as though I were watching it happen to someone else standing just behind me. 5 days before the wedding, my older sister, already 3 years married herself, came to help me finish the hems on my dress, and while we worked, she told me something I had not known, that Amos had gone to the deacon himself, weeks before, and asked for the same small thing I had asked for, one honest conversation with me before the vows were spoken, and that the deacon had told him it was not necessary, that the fathers had settled it, and a conversation would only unsettle what was already decided. My sister told me she had waited to say anything until now, so close to the wedding, because she had not wanted to trouble me with it if the bishop was only going to refuse us both the same way regardless. I sat with the needle still in my hand for a long moment. It had not occurred to me that he might have wanted the same door I wanted and been told no in the same plain voice. That evening I asked my father if I might speak with the bishop directly, not to refuse the match, I said that clearly, only to ask for one honest exchange before I stood up in front of the GMA and made a promise I could not take back. My father was uneasy about it, but he did not forbid it, and he agreed to walk with me to the bishop's farm 2 days later. If you were ever spoken for the way I was, matched and settled by people who loved you and never once asked what you needed to hear before you said yes, I would ask you to put the first question you wish someone had let you ask down in the comments below, and if this kind of story is one you want to keep hearing, I would ask you to subscribe, because there is more of it still to tell. I did not know, walking away from that conversation with my father, whether the bishop would grant the meeting at all, or whether I was asking for something too large for a girl 5 days from her wedding to be asking for. I turned it over the whole rest of that evening, the thought that a man in another household was learning the very same lesson I was, from his own deacon, in his own kitchen, and that neither of us had been given so much as a name for what we wanted, only a shared and separate refusal. We walked to the bishop's farm after the afternoon milking, my father and I, along the lane where the buggy wheels had cut deep ruts still soft from the last rain, and I remember stopping at the pump by his barn to drink cold water from my cupped hands before we went up to the house, my throat too dry to trust my own voice. Inside, the men's hats hung in a row on pegs by the door, plain and identical, and through the kitchen doorway I could see the women of that household canning late tomatoes at the back table, jars lined up catching the last light. The whole yard smelled of wood smoke and cut hay, and somewhere behind the barn, a rooster called out of turn, the way roosters sometimes do in the middle of an ordinary afternoon for no reason anyone can name. My father did not speak the whole walk over, and I did not ask him to. The bishop received us in his front room, where a clock ticked above his desk, steady and unhurried, the same kind of clock that had measured out every ordinary afternoon of my 8th grade schooling before it ended, the same schooling that had taught me sums and reading and nothing at all about how to ask a grown man for what I needed. I had no money of my own to speak of, nothing that was mine apart from what my father, or soon my husband, decided to give me, and I felt that plainly sitting across from the bishop's desk, in a way I had never quite felt it before. I had brought my question again, written small on a fresh scrap of paper, and I set it on the desk between us. He read it without any hurry, folded it once, and closed it inside the pages of his Bible, the way a man might press a flower to keep it flat, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. My father sat very straight beside me, his hat in his lap. The women's voices carried faintly from the back room, the clink of jars, an ordinary weekday sound, while I waited to learn whether I had done something foolish in coming here. I studied the grain of his desk while I waited, the small nicks worn into the wood by other hands that had rested there before mine, other questions that had likely been folded and put away in that same manner, long before my own question ever reached that room. The bishop folded his hands over the closed Bible and began, at last, to answer me, in the calm and measured voice men in his position always used, and I sat forward to hear what he would say, certain that whatever came next would decide the shape of the rest of my life, though I could not yet have told you what question I expected him to ask me in return. What the bishop finally asked me, in that quiet front room with the clock ticking above his desk, was this: what words could change what your father has already promised? He did not ask what I needed. He did not ask what frightened me about marrying a man whose voice I had never heard. He asked it the way a teacher asks a child a sum already worked out on the board, expecting the one correct figure returned to him, not a new one. He asked me plainly whether any words at all could undo a promise already made between two fathers, and I understood, sitting there with my hands folded the way my mother had taught me, that he was not asking a real question so much as testing whether I understood my place well enough to answer it correctly. I said, none, because it was the only answer the room would allow, the only answer that let me leave that house still engaged to be married, and still in good standing with my family and my district. We walked home in the last of the daylight, my father quiet beside me, and 3 days later I stood in my new bedroom in my deep blue dress, listening to a pair of work boots stop just inside the door. It was only then, with that door closed against the rest of the house, that Amos spoke for the first time in my hearing, his voice lower and steadier than I had imagined it, and he told me he had asked twice to speak with me before the wedding and been refused both times, and that he had written down what he most wanted to ask me, and had it returned to him unopened. He held it out to me now, still folded, still sealed exactly as he had left it. I opened it there in the lamplight. It asked only 2 things: whether I wished to go on keeping my mother's garden after our marriage, since he knew how much that ground meant to me, and whether I was afraid. I answered him aloud, for the first time in either of our lives speaking directly to the other, and told him yes to the garden, and yes, some, to the fear, and he nodded slowly as though both answers mattered to him exactly as much as I had said them. It was not love yet, not the kind told in English stories. It was 2 people finally standing in the same room, hearing each other plainly for the first time, and recognizing, each in the other, someone who had also been asking, quietly, for the same small door. Neither of us said anything further for a while after that. We only sat together in the lamplight, the folded note resting between us on the quilt, before either of us thought to reach over and put out the flame. Our marriage did not turn easy after that night, and I want to be honest about that. We still lived inside the same Ordnung, the same G-May, the same watchful eyes of a bishop who would not have approved of a wife speaking first on any matter of consequence. But Amos and I made a private practice between ourselves, small and unspoken outside our own kitchen, that no household decision was final until each of us had spoken once about it, plainly, out loud, even if the speaking took place quietly at our own table and nowhere else. We kept a slate beside the flour bin for the ordinary things, which fields to put in feed corn, whether to sell the extra eggs or keep them, and we would each write a word or two before either of us called it settled. He drove me by buggy to my mother's garden most Saturday mornings that first summer, not because he had been told to, but because he had listened, that first night, when I told him what that ground meant to me, and he never once let me forget that he remembered it. We both understood the risk in what we were doing. A wife who answered first, even quietly, even only at her own table, was a wife the bishop might one day take note of, and the consequence of that falling wrong would land far heavier on me than on Amos, because that is how it was measured in our district. A husband's leadership questioned lightly, a wife's obedience questioned harshly. Amos never once acted as though he had rescued me from anything. He was learning alongside me, slowly, the same as I was, both of us finding out together what it looked like to keep a marriage and a faith and a small measure of honesty all at the same time, in a district that had not exactly made room for it, but had not, in the end, torn us apart for trying either. Some weeks the slate held nothing more serious than whether to patch the henhouse roof before the harvest or after it. And even then we made a small ceremony of the writing, each of us taking the chalk in turn, because the size of the decision mattered less to us than the keeping of the practice. Once, when my mother visited and noticed the slate leaning there with both our marks upon it, she only looked at it a long moment and said nothing at all, and I never knew afterward whether her silence that day was disapproval or something closer to a relief she did not yet have words for either. If you come from a family, or a church, or a community of any kind that has taught you to mistake silence for peace, I want you to hear this from someone who still wears the cop and still keeps the ordnung of her own district and still believes, most days, in the life she was raised to live. I am not asking anyone watching this to leave their faith, or their family, or the district that raised them. I am only asking that inside whatever life you keep, someone lets you speak once, honestly, before a promise is finished being made in your name. A vow is not made more faithful by removing the voices of the two people making it. Quiet is not the same thing as peace, and obedience is not the same thing as being unheard. I honor my people. I honor the fathers who believed they were protecting me, and the mother who smoothed my cap strings out of love and not out of cruelty, and even the bishop who was doing, in his own understanding, exactly what his office asked of him. I do not tell you this story to turn any of them into villains. I tell it because I still keep, folded in the bottom of my sewing basket, the note Amos gave me that first night, unopened until I opened it myself, and I keep it there as evidence of something I want other wives to know, that a husband asking two honest questions of his new wife, and a wife answering him plainly out loud, is not rebellion against anything true or good. It is only two people being honest inside a life that asked a great deal of both of them. If somewhere in your own house or your own church there is a door being kept closed between two people who are meant to spend the whole of their lives together, I hope you find some small way, the way Amos and I found ours, to let one true sentence pass between you before it is too late to matter. There is more to that first year than fits inside one video. More evenings at that slate beside the flour bin, more mornings driving to my mother's garden, more of what it cost me and what it gave me to learn a whole marriage one honest sentence at a time. I have put some of that into a small book, for the women who want to sit longer with the quieter parts of it. It is not a long book, only the parts that could not fit here, told the same plain way. I wrote the rest of it down. You will find the link in the description below and in the first pinned comment.